To talk about the future of the Israel-Hamas conflict, I am joined live and exclusive on the news track by a very special guest. One of Israel's most decorated war heroes, a former Israeli Special Forces commando, Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, and former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. Mr. Barak, welcome and thank you. I want to tell our viewers that Ehud Barak was the Prime Minister of Israel in the year 2000 when the Second Intifada, or the Palestinian uprising, erupted in Gaza and the West Bank. Before that, he was commander of the Israel Defense Forces when Israel carried out its first major pullback from the cities in the Gaza Strip as part of the Oslo Accord, which was signed in 1993. In his second stint as Defense Minister in 2009, Ehud Barak oversaw Israel's largest ground operation against the Hamas in Gaza. And as Israel gets set for another ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, Ehud Barak is the perfect guest to talk about the challenges that await the IDF in Gaza and what Israel needs to do next. Mr. Barak, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by asking you about the delay in the Israel Defense Forces attack into the Gaza Strip. From the first day, we've been hearing from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that an IDF invasion into Gaza is about to begin. 2 weeks on, it hasn't started yet. Do you think it is wise for Israel to hold off this attack into the Gaza Strip? When do you think might be the right time for this to start? And once it starts, what shape and form do you see this ground invasion into Gaza take, Mr. Barak?
The objectives of operation are clear. We have to eliminate any military capability of Hamas and its capability to keep ruling the Gaza Strip. This objective cannot be fully accomplished through the air strikes and bombs and whatever. You have to deploy forces on the ground in order to make sure that there are no more launchers, rockets, munition depot, training center, command and control center, whatever, even office. And those who perpetrated this terrible barbaric attack on Israel will be identified and have to be accountable for what they did. So it's almost inevitable, I don't like the word inevitable, but almost inevitable to deploy these ground forces. But the operation is constrained by 4 elements. I count them shortly. One is the hostages, which are there, and they create very delicate constraint. Secondly is the risk that it will spread to the north, to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, probably some others, and become a regional war. Third is the international law. Israel is committed to international law. And in spite of the barbaric attack, we have to do our best to minimize the amount of innocent citizens killed there, because we need the universal support that we have now and the legitimacy of action to be kept as long as possible. And last but not least is once we complete the mission, assume that in 3 months or 6 months from now, no one can predict the length of the operation, we really control the Gaza Strip, eliminated any kind of capability of Hamas. Still, there is a question to whom we pass the torch. We do not plan to stay there for the next 20 years or so. So all these constraints are intertwined, interconnected, and develop in real time. So none of us can give a trajectory or predict exactly how and...
Mr. Barak, I want to take all of what you said one by one, and I'll start with the situation with the hostages. 2 Israelis, 2 Americans have been freed, drawing global attention and emotion within Israel about the plight of the 224 hostages who, at last count, the IDF says are still with Hamas terrorists. In the past, Israel has negotiated for the release of soldiers. Does it make sense for Israel to be in some kind of a behind-the-scenes negotiation with the Hamas through Qatar for the release of these hostages, or do you think this is a time when Israel should absolutely not negotiate?
I want to complete the first answer, and it will explain the second one.
Okay.
Only those who are in control of all the details, the data, the nuances, and the real-time development can make the decision. We cannot make it on TV. So we put it at the head of war cabinet, added two leaders from the opposition. Both of them were commanders of the armed forces of Israel. One was even the Minister of Defense until a year ago, and we have to trust them. Now to your question. Hostages is very sensitive because we have a moral and basic commitment to them. They are there because Israel failed in protecting them before they were hijacked. So it's a very major consideration. Until now, only two of them were released. Of course, if there is an opportunity to wait another few days and get a major fraction of them, elderly people or women or children, something like this, it justifies waiting for another few days. But there is a risk that it will start to stretch in small pieces and basically becomes a weapon of Hamas through Qatar to avoid an Israeli invasion on the ground. That should not necessarily be allowed to happen because we have a compelling imperative. No sovereign can afford Daesh or ISIS-like organization to sit on its border and kill Israelis on this kind of volume. India is about 120 times the population of Israel. So think what would have been if within one day India would lose to organizations like Qaeda or I know ISIS or Lashkar-e-Taiba lose at one day, let's say 200,000 people. That's crazy. You would immediately act forcefully, and it cannot be the issue of the hostages, very sensitive, very high on our priority, but we should lead those who run the issue, the war cabinet, to make these subtle, delicate decisions. When to start, in spite of the fact that we do not have all the hostages in our hands.
Let's come to the second point you made about the possibility of this conflict expanding. We're already seeing attacks from the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. We're seeing some attacks come in from Syria. We've also seen the Supreme Leader of Iran make a very strong public statement in support of the Hamas. Do you think this is likely to become a multi-pronged conflict like the Six-Day War, where Israel has multiple enemies that it has to fight at the same time? And can the modern-day Israel fight with enemies on multiple fronts?
I would say it's a 50-50%, not because I know something that make it 50 and not 40 or 60. I just don't know, and no one knows. It can't deteriorate. Probably the Iranians are prodding them to intervene. Probably they decide on their own to participate. But even if they do not want to intervene, and we have no interest that they will intervene, as a result of the daily exchanges along the border in the last week or so, it might deteriorate without any side like it to happen into full-scale clash in the north. Now, there are two steps or three steps that help us to tackle with this challenge. Number one is the fact that immediately after the shock of the first 2 days, we mobilized over 300,000 reservist soldiers beyond the regular standing army. Number two, that immediately within 48 hours, Americans start to supply us with the airlift that is bringing munition and spare parts and whatever else we need. Moreover, President Biden sent one aircraft carrier group, now probably another aircraft carrier group, in order to make sure that it will be a kind of deterrence element to Hezbollah, probably deterrence for the government of Lebanon, while at the same time assuring them that they will be protected by the Americans, and even a signal to Iran not to intervene. No one knows. If it breaks, we will, the same way that we are capable of dealing with Hamas. It's more complicated in the north, but if it is imposed upon us, we will fight both of them, and we will win this war as well.
Now, American intelligence says that Iran was caught off guard with this attack. They say they have substantive evidence to suggest that Iranian officials were actually caught by surprise after the 7th of October. You're also a military man and a very fine commander yourself. Given the scale and precision of this Hamas attack, and you fought them in the past in Gaza, do you think the Hamas by itself is capable of pulling off an attack of this nature? Or are you convinced that Israel was up against not just the Hamas, but by military minds in Iran's Revolutionary Guards?
About the first question, I also read these reports. I don't think that Hamas asked for Iranian permission to launch this attack, as the Wall Street Journal or other newspapers in America wrote. Reason is that I believe that Hamas is afraid that the Iranians are more deeply penetrated by American intelligence and Israeli intelligence than the Hamas itself. So there was risk from their point of view that if they make the Iranian part of the decision-making process, they will lose the surprise vis-a-vis Israel. But having said that, the Iranians are helping them. They're helping them with munition, with training, with some kind of probably advising them about tactics or so on. But I don't believe that they need approval for them. About the other question, it's clear that the Hamas showed higher, probably better fighting capabilities and hiding capabilities and operational capabilities than we thought of in advance of 7th of October. So now we understand that they are a little bit stronger. But mainly once they meet, there are some 30,000 of them. Once they meet the heavy Israeli army, well-trained and well-equipped and so on, it doesn't mean that we can bypass the need to invest toil and sweat and tears and blood in any successful military operation, but I'm confident Hamas cannot produce an existential threat to Israel, and we will win over them, even if it takes several months. And the same applies to Hezbollah. Hezbollah makes it much more complicated, but once again, Hamas and Hezbollah together cannot put an existential threat on Israel. We will over both if they will make the mistake and join into this war.
I want to tell our viewers that Mr. Ehud Barak has known Israel's current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for at least 55 years. Mr. Barak commanded the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit, which is a secretive commando unit, where at that time Benjamin Netanyahu served in that unit. And Netanyahu's older brother, Yoni Netanyahu, was a commander of this unit who was killed while rescuing hostages at the Entebbe airport in 1976. And Yoni Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu's elder brother, was one of Ehud Barak's closest friends. So that being said, Mr. Barak, you've known Netanyahu for 6 decades now. What do you think is going through the mind of Israel's Prime Minister? Is his political career over because of the failure of the 7th of October? He's a survivor, he's a fighter. Can he find a way out of this crisis?
I cannot penetrate his soul as a psychologist or professional, and I'm not sure that it's the proper thing to do at the opening of a war vis-a-vis your television. Uttar Pradesh is a huge, highly respected state with a population that is about the United States, Canada, and Israel together. And I'm sure that the Hamas and the Iranians are listening to your TV. So I don't think, I don't want to analyze, but I might say the truth that Netanyahu is a very capable person, and he understands politics very well, and for sure he thinks on all alternatives. But he got the mandate to control from the parliament, from the Knesset, almost a year ago. But during the day of 7th of October, he lost the trust of the public. Polls that are running this week show that 80% of the population believe he is the main responsible for this blow, which is the most severe one that Israel has suffered since its establishment, about the time that India was established. And when you ask about what he should do, 70% of the population, including majority of his own voters, say he had to resign. Some of them say to resign immediately, some of them say to resign only after the war. But in Israeli mind, wars, the 6 days war was 1 week. The famous Yom Kippur war was 2.5 weeks. The second Lebanese war, a month. The longest operation was 5 years ago in Gaza against the Hamas, took almost 2 months. So Israel is thinking in terms of short wars. When you tackle them with the question, but if the war takes 2 years, some of them hesitate and say, yes, it should be delayed. Others say, no, he has to resign now. So he basically in the deepest crisis of leadership since he came to power, and he was the longest serving prime minister of Israel. I defeated him in general election in 1999, but later on he became once again prime minister and is serving most of the last 15 years.
No, so you've been part of the street protests over the last 9 months, trying to stop Mr. Netanyahu's government from making constitutional changes to curb the powers of the Supreme Court. Now, we in India and many across the world are in awe of the human and technical capabilities of the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the IDF. And the biggest question that's asked the world over, especially in India, is how could the mighty Israeli Defense Forces and the intelligence services, on whom so many books and movies are made, how could they allow for an attack of this magnitude to be launched right under their noses? What do you think went wrong?
First of all, it happened. So it means that it can happen, even to good intelligence service. It's a major failure of our intelligence. They should give us both kind of strategic warning several months ago, and for sure a tactical warning the night before. It's a failure. As usual, as was the case with 9/11 and with our 73 war, you go backward even to World War II, to Pearl Harbor or Barbarossa. In retrospect, you will find that there were many, many pieces of information that were known but were not interpreted properly under certain conception, so that somehow Hamas is deterred and they are not capable to do something so dramatic. It's a grave mistake that we paid very, very heavily for it. It's also with, in spite of heroic operation of the soldiers on the ground and the first responders that came, and even civilians within the kibbutzim, within the villages, civilians with handguns fought against those heavily equipped terrorists. In spite of their heroic operation, it's also failure of our forces on the ground. So we will discuss it after the war. And in regard to the other part of your question, which I think was about the judicial reform. I am one of the harshest critiques of Netanyahu for this judicial reform that our living Supreme Court chief defined when it was announced some 10 months ago. She said, this is not a judicial reform. This is a blatant attempt to crash the independence of the Supreme Court and push Israel out of the family of democracies. And I criticize maybe heavily for it, but more important in regard to the war now, the leaders of our defense establishment, the Minister of Defense, his Minister of Defense, the Minister of Defense nominated by Netanyahu, and the chief of staff, and the head of intelligence, and the head of the secret service, all warned him in March, 7 months ago, that there is an imminent and apparent risk to our national security as a result of this amok run toward the legislation of this judicial coup d'etat. And 3 months ago, in July, they passed one of the laws, a series of laws from this coup d'etat, judicial coup d'etat, where once again the Minister of Defense, the head of Armed Forces, the head of intelligence, insisted they have to tell the cabinet and tell the members of Knesset what are these national security implications of passing this law. And Netanyahu didn't allow them to do that. And that's a very heavy responsibility on Netanyahu, because first of all, Netanyahu is not American president, he's not commander-in-chief. In Israel, it's the whole government, he's just a first-among equal. But more than this, because of the reason, everyone understands why Netanyahu didn't let the security or defense establishment to brief the ministers and the members of Knesset. The reason is, he understood that if they will hear the risk to the national security from this legislation, they would not vote for it. And he needed this law in order to paralyze the Supreme Court. And he needed to paralyze the Supreme Court in order to taking himself out of his criminal court case. He's standing a trial for bribery and breach of trust and fraud. And he wants to use, that's where his personal interest to get rid of his court case intervene with the national security of the nation. And that's heavy burden that he carries with him.
Okay, Mr. Barak, the US President Joe Biden has said that one of the reasons Hamas attacked at this time is because of the India-Middle East Europe corridor, which was agreed upon during the G20 summit in New Delhi recently, and that's raised a lot of questions in India. Do you think that one of the reasons that the Hamas has attacked at this time is indeed because India, the Middle East and Europe were trying to come together in this corridor, and Israel's relations with countries like Saudi Arabia, thanks to American brokerage or partnership, was actually getting better, and Saudi Arabia would have had formal ties with Israel, and that's one of the reasons why Israel has been attacked by the Hamas at this time?
First of all, I have to tell you that the idea of the corridor and the initiative are very important, very positive development. We are thankful to Prime Minister Modi and for the Indian nation to stand by together with the other, or to be pioneers of this project. I think it's very important. I am not sure whether this was the reason, kind of the most important reason, or exclusively the reason. But very probably it was part of the reason. Another element which probably was more centered on the minds of the Hamas is the talking about trilateral deal between the United States,